sick of the crazy? Are you tired of the lies? Well, maybe it's time to get ready for the Republic of the Real, because it's about to get real. Welcome to the Republic of the Real. When you live in a world where so little is real, it's about time that some of us start getting real loud. Real courageous. And helping people understand how it is that we got here so we can get real busy changing the trajectory of this country. So it's pretty clear when you look around to see how crazy all aspects of the world that we live in is getting. Across the 7 spheres and around the world. We live in a time where uncertainty has overtaken expectations of certainty. We live in a world that has become overcome by its fear, confusion, rage, anger, hatred, avarice, hubris. We live in a world where it seems like everyone is turning against everyone else. We're living in a world where you are watching people do what is right in their own eyes. And such a world brings about a world of chaos, a world of confusion, a world of insanity. It is a world on the cusp of the old dying and the new being birthed. So what would that be? What do you think that's going to look like? What do you think the world is going to be like? During the birthing process we're entering into, and after, what do you think it's going to take for us to get to that point? What will be the consequences rendered as the old falls away and the new rises? What will it look like for people and for the nations? So I was looking at the news today, which I rarely do. I actually ignore the news as much as I can. And what I saw was just how terrible the flooding, storms have been all over Western Europe and throughout parts of Asia. Now, the constant drumbeat on this is it's global climate change. Well, of course it is. What do you think we're entering into? Part of the birthing process is a change, a restoration of what was before it got polluted by what is. Now, you can say that is due all to human beings. And that is what's causing climate change. The crazy weather. Well, that's partially true, but not in the way that you're thinking. You're thinking that our physical reality of it, right? And it's true, there is an impact on the biosphere, particularly by emerging nations and by large nations like China, who likes to blame everybody else and wants everybody else to carry the weight for the bubble that they live in. But you also are in a much larger meta pattern, a meta cycle. And that cycle is one which is definitively one that is it throughout our entire solar system, as well as the broader Milky Way galaxy that you're in and universe in general. You see, you don't generally think of it in those terms. We're very myopic as a species. And we're very myopic as individuals. But you do exist in a much bigger reality, both within the physical temporal reality and in the overarching infinite reality which it sits in like a bubble. So it is our natural inclinations when we see things occurring to put them into a frame of reference that is in that myopathy. And that simply has not worked well for humanity, having done that over and over and over throughout our history. It also has been taken advantage of over and over and over again by unprincipled people, ideologies nation states, empires, and spiritual powers and principalities in the metasphere. See, people don't like to talk about that. Every generation thinks it's more evolved than all the others that came before it. Just like all the empires that rose and fell all thought that they were impervious. They all thought they were impervious to the very things that allowed them to rise over those that came before them. And then, having not learned the lessons, actually rerun it in their own avarice and hubris. Right? That is the cycle of human history. You can deny it all you want. You can pretend like it doesn't exist. And you can pretend like you yourself are terminally unique in it. And your generation is terminally unique in it. However, that would be a lie. And you would be engaging in the very thing that you are trying to deny, and thereby creating the very conditions that I'm trying to warn you about. So when we look at the times we're in, one could say that we are ruled in a very fleshy kind of way by our new Holy Trinity, the me, myself, and I, the super subjective. Now, in reality, that may seem like a new thing, but it's actually been human history all along. Again, people do not learn from history, and they don't learn from their own mistakes. And as people are like that, so too it is for nations. See, nothing new is under the sun, including all the machinations and intrigues thereof that drive that cycle around and around and around like a millstone hung around every generation's neck. But we are in a rather unique time in that we are in a time of convergence of many, many trends, many, many things, historical patterns and trends, converging with natural trends and patterns at a unique time and space and history. And that's what I mean when I talk about something is being birthed. And a birthing process is very painful. All of you ladies out there that have had children, I'm sure you could give a lot of the men a lesson on that, right? So, when you think about the world that you are in, think about applying some of those ideas, some of those concepts, some of the things that you've dealt with, right? And if you're a woman, being a mother, right? Birthing. And apply that to the time period that we're in as nation states, as peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations, right? And as the collective of humanity, existing in this time and place in the universe, in our mortal coils. You see, it's going to be painful. Every birth is. Every birth is painful for a period of time. But you see, again, that's where the myopathy kicks in, right? We don't want to feel any pain. We don't want to risk anything. We don't want to suffer, right? Well, who does? But sometimes if you are going to get to something better, you're going to actually move into something that's better for you. The process of saying goodbye to the old, letting go of it, is a necessary thing, and it can be painful. It can be very difficult. It's difficult when we have to do that with those that we love, We have to say goodbye, let go. And we are in a cycle here, right? Individual, a life cycle, right? We're born, we live it out, and then we die. That's the temporal reality. Now, though a lot of people believe that there's nothing after this, they can't actually prove that with anything, but they sure like to spend a great deal of their lives trying to prove that people that believe opposite of them, right, are fools for believing there's something more than this temporal reality. Now, that seems like a kind of a waste of one's temporal life if you truly do not believe that there's nothing, that there's nothing beyond this, right? Why would you spend so much of your energy and your time trying to convince people of what you believe that believe different than you? I mean, that's kind of focusing on the very thing you say doesn't exist, yet it's giving you so much trouble that you somehow obsess on it. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, right? Because we all really know that's bullshit. I mean, if we're real about it, we all know that that's a game people play. So what I'm going to attempt to do in these Republic of the Real talks is to get real honest with you about the reality of what we're dealing with here in the world, using the 7 spheres of society as kind of a guide, right? I'm going to go around the horn on each of these, and there's 7 days in the week, so I'm going to try to take each of those 7 spheres and do one or more and apply that to things going on in our current events while trying to connect dots for you, or help you think about it so you can connect the dots. Because when you live in a world that is so fake, when you live in a world like we do that seems like it's a dream state or a horror movie or whatever it is that your present perceptions of it are, sometimes it's difficult to even believe that anything real still exists. But I assure you, if it didn't exist, you wouldn't be struggling with that question. And we're going to dive into why that is. And we're going to dive into how those questions and those perceptions aggregate across the 7 spheres of society and create a reality that explains why it is I tell you, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. Well, only thing I can say is we have reached new heights of insanity, and just when you think things could get at least stabilized, this administration manages to push the crazy button beyond the tolerances of the button. It is quite amazing. It's like living in, I don't know. I mean, it's sheer insanity. So go ahead. Well, it's, the thing about it is completely synthetic, right? I mean, it is completely contrived, and it's like you have a group of people that's living in an alternate reality that think that appeasement and paying off the mob is going to actually end crime. I mean, it's insanity. Yeah. Worldview is important. How people think, how they view the world, how they view others and view themselves is incredibly important. And it really does guide their decision making. And if their worldview is abhorrent, distorted, irrational, or completely degenerate, it shows up in everything that they do. And it creates a cascade effect of consequences that they deny. And as they deny it, the consequences get worse, driving them further into a delusion. I would say, I would say that it's more than polluting how the nation's making decisions. I would say that it is a form of darkness born of cognitive dissonance that's turned into distortion, that's turned into self-destruction. Unfortunately, when you have people that are wedded to lies, and they prefer the lies over any truth or facts, I mean, that level of disreality has incredibly destructive implications for everybody else that has to live with them. I mean, it's almost like we're in a nation run by a bunch of drunk, high mental patients. They literally are insane, and that's what happens. As you look at this, you can't help but think, how can somebody become so disconnected from reality other than they actually truly want disreality? And I think that's why it's difficult for a lot of people to actually accept, because it's so crazy that it doesn't even seem real to them, right? And that works to their benefit in some ways. Well, I think when you look at it from a individual, from the micros to the macro, it's born of fear. And of course, fear being false evidence appearing real, and false evidence appearing real and confusion it walks people through basically from a neurosis into a psychosis, and it's a banishment of anything that's objectively, testable. They redefine everything. I mean, it ends in psychotic delusion, and that's what we're dealing with. I mean, just looking at the news today, it was pretty obvious. I mean, the duplicity in it. Right? The disconnect from, it's the ultimate postmodern suicide at a macro scale. Well, what are they afraid of? That's a good question to ask. What are they truly afraid of? Well, I mean, I'm not even saying, I would say that it's not even about what people are accustomed to seeing. I would say that they have embarked upon a completely inverted view of reality that is creating the very conditions they fear worse, which fuels more fear, which fuels more confusion, which fuels more risk aversion, which fuels more bad decisions, which amplifies the seriousness of their predicament. And that's a difficult thing to break, because people, when they are in that position, when they've gone down that path, the only thing that you can really do is, well, you can accept the insanity, and that it becomes to the point where you can only accept that so long, because it's so intrusive on everything and everybody and everybody's lives, or you have to remove them. I mean, if nothing else, for their own good and the good of everybody else, because they're dangerous to themselves and to the nation at large and the nations. It's a terrible predicament for the entire nation to be in. I mean, it's a form of desolation, that is incredibly inverted from the reality that we have to actually deal with. They're creating everything that they say they're against. Well, that's what they're trying to do, is to cover it up and divert, because that they're projecting onto the public what it is they're doing in their own heads and within their own administrative positions. They are in denial of their predicament, and by doing that, right, your predicament doesn't go away; it actually gets worse. It's like a addiction cycle, right? You deny to the point where what actually happens is you create a point of terminus, where you hit what's called zero tolerance, where you're in a terminal condition. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with people that are going into a psychotic delusion, and it becomes at a mass scale, you've seen this throughout history in many ways. I mean, look at the Cultural Revolution. That's a great example of it under Mao. But every nation state that collapsed. Now, the thing is, the country hasn't collapsed. It's just those people making decisions that make it appear that way. That's the irony of it, right? I mean, so their impacts are creating the appearances of one thing when the reality isn't necessarily that, but it's being imposed on everybody, which increases the likelihood that their choices and decisions are going to actually go so far that they create the very things that their delusions have been telling them that everything is, right? You see what I mean? To some degree, in terms of their own perceptions, not in reality, but they're actually self-destructive. And it's not just that they're self-destructive, in a self-immolating kind of manner, but they're also destructive to everybody else. So you have kind of like suicide and homicide, right? I mean, they're genocidal. They're becoming genocidal. And that is a form of mass genocide, is a form of mass suicide. Because ultimately, they're the ones that are going to be destroyed if they continue doing this. Well, they're identified. I think it's called Stockholm syndrome, right? They're identifying with their threat to the point where they've become wedded to their threat, their own destruction, and they can't tell the difference. They're completely inverted, right? And so they actually have an affinity towards their own death and destruction, which is siding with the very people that would ultimately destroy them. But the problem is that everybody else pays the price too, right? I mean, I talked to a friend of mine earlier, and I mean, he was appalled that just even the appearance of disagreement in an area of stuff going on, and these people are like going berserk, saying everybody needs to be destroyed that doesn't agree with them. I mean, like literally destroyed. What they don't realize is they're actually creating the conditions for themselves to be destroyed by doing that. It's a form of hysteria, It's a very bizarre thing to witness, and it's an even more terrible thing to have to try to live with. It's paranoid delusions. They're imagining stuff, and then essentially creating the conditions to feed the madness that they're under a spell of, right? And in doing that, they're a wrecking ball. They're destroying everybody else's opportunities and their futures. And fear drives people to want to control more and more and more. But the more they control, the more they fuel their fear of losing control, and actually do lose control, which fuels the desire to grab more control, right? You see how the whole thing, it amplifies against itself in a feedback loop. And it ultimately reaches a point where there's such systematic errors when it's at a macro level, say within the government and within business and everything else, and it's a destroyer. It's a destructive scenario that is like malicious code running in the minds of the people and in the systems of a nation state. Well, what they do, and because of their distortion of reality and their cognitive biases and their confirmation biases and the distortion of their perception, is that they project onto others their own delusions. And it can be very disorienting for people that are trying to have a rational discourse, some sort of rational conversation with them, because people that are self-balancing, self-checking, they check themselves and they're willing to hear others out, and they realize that they could be wrong, right? That the other side, right, the folks that are under the delusion, by projecting on them, they actually take advantage of that, right? And it's what has a hold of them. That's kind of how the malicious code kind of spreads, right? So when you think about communication and you think about disease, right? Disease, we talk about diseases that spread, like a virus. They're communicable diseases. Well, put that in terms of psychosis and, from an ideologically distorted perspective. It's a communicable disease. That's why the disease metaphor works well with it, because of spread factor, right? Spread rate. And then when you've got folks that are in positions within the media, within social media, in terms of technology companies and stuff, and they're trying to, they're using those as a means of propagating and broadcasting their own psychosis. It has an impact, right? That's what I mean by they're sowing the wind, they reap the whirlwind. They literally sow the very things, the seeds of their own destruction, that bring a whirlwind of destruction because of their state of mind and being. And when you talk about people that have addictions are physiological, psychological, and spiritual. There are three components to them. And all of those conspire together to create a binding on the individual, and it distorts everything about them. That's why they live in a denial cycle, right? And it's destroying them. It's actually really sad. It's pitiful, and that's why you have to do interventions on people, or try to do interventions on people before they destroy themselves and others when they've got, a serious addiction problem. And now, how do you do that, right? How does that play out at a nation state level, right? As it is for people, so too it is for nations, right? So what does that look like? Well, look at the language sets we use in national security, right? We use intervention. We have to intervene, right? To stabilize the nation. We have to intervene. We call certain operations in other nations interventions, right? So the language set is used across all of those, which is very interesting when you think about that, right? Because that language set is actually borrowed from epidemiology. And so, yeah, right? In the same way that epidemiology, right, borrows, right? When you're looking at I can't even say it, I'm so tired. Virology, right, in epidemiology, in terms of the spread and how these things can, work through a population, right? It's kind of like the difference between psychology and sociology, right? The micros and the macros. You've got these pathologies, right? And the language sets for communication systems are the same ones that are actually used for how we describe illness and how illness is spread. And it's also, in terms of treatment regimens, we use that same language across all of those, right? I mean, there's a unity in a weird way of how all those language sets work across all those buckets. And when you've got, it's why I'm looking at this from the point of view, if you look at it as a disease cycle, right? The pathology, you can look at crime the same way, right? We call them social maladies, right? So a malady is what? You know the definition of a malady? If you got a computer there, you should look it up or look it up on your phone, you know? But a malady is you know, it's an aberrant, you know, causality, you know, a pathology. It's like a disease, right? And then we use those same language sets across in cyber, right? In cybersec, in cybersecurity, right, as well. So we talk about malicious code, viruses, computer viruses, infections. Your network's been infected, right? All of those things, again, are borrowing from the same language sets. They're unified concepts that play out across multiple disciplines. And when you're dealing with it from a national security point of view, and you've got what you have going on here, I mean, at some point, you have to start considering an intervention. And that's where things really start to get very complicated, because you don't want to do that. I mean, if you've got people in power that are infected, right, with fear, confusion, and reaching a point of, you know, psychosis, and their choices, their decisions, which are guided by their thinking, their ideological foundations, and their perceptions, if they're distorted, right, and they don't see it because they're in denial of it, right, and they're affecting more and more people, including more and more nations, there's a point at which you have to start considering what you're going to do to mitigate the problem, whether you want to or not, especially when those people are in power and they're removing other options, right? That's the problem within our system, is they're trying to remove options from people. And by removing options, it's a form of lawlessness, right? The term is Anomy. And when you're dealing with that at the stage that we're dealing with it, it is very disorienting for most people, because a lot of people, especially right now, they just want to go back to living in normalcy, what they consider normalcy before COVID or whatever, right? And all of those things mix up with the complexities of the stressors of the fear from COVID, the confusion from it, and the constant, programming and social engineering that's occurring. It's a perfect storm. And then now you have these realities where these people are making decisions that are exponentially increasing their own complexities and the complexities that everybody else has to deal with in an already complex environment that ups and amplifies the threatscape to everyone. And that ultimately has to be mitigated. It's the same reason why you have a civil government, to mitigate lawlessness. And when lawlessness takes root in a government, it has to be removed, either externally or from mechanisms within it. And that's a form of intervention. That's why you have the separation of powers and checks and balances within the system. But when those things are being completely ignored or distorted and weaponized and inverted, well, that's what I mean by a removing of options. And as options are removed off the table that were built into the system, they're creating the conditions and actually making the decisions for others to force their hand to actually have to intervene to prevent them from their own self-destruction and the destruction of all the entire nation state and other nations. No, it's not. And the damage is great already. That's why, I mean, again, when you apply the as it is for people, so too it is for a nation modality, you apply that as a conceptual framework to view things from, and you actually look at it from what it is, that isn't a logical framework to view it from. And it's true. The problem comes in is when people take concepts that are true and they're viewing them from an inverted point of view. And then they project that out. That's very deceptive. And that's what's happening right now. They're taking things that are true, inverting them and using them wrongly. So when you take something that's true and something in a correct context, take it out of the context, you misappropriate it. And by misappropriating it, right, you then misapply it. And in misapplying it, you misuse it. And you mislead yourself and others, ultimately creating the conditions that you were trying to mitigate, doing it the wrong way, regardless of your intent, because you're self-deceived, right? You start deceiving others, and you really think you're doing what's right in your own eyes, but what you're really doing, though it seems right in your own eyes, if you're in darkness, right? If you're deceived, what you're actually doing is the opposite, and that starts to appear very quickly as the outcomes. The fruit on the tree, so to speak, begins to mature. And that's where they don't have control. They want control of outcomes. They want to force outcomes, but that's not how the world works. So they deny it. They actually deny the very reality that they create because it requires of them to have their denial broken, right? And to accept responsibility for their actions that created the predicament that they're in, and they put others in, and then they play the victim card, right? When they're the one victimizing others and themselves by believing a lie and denying their own culpability for their own actions. You do. You need a couple of Jenga blocks to be removed from their constructural framework. In terms of people and their structures, yes. And it eventually starts happening when the situation becomes so painful and people start cracking, right? That's what I mean by eventually what will happen is people will either be humbled, right, and deal with stuff, take responsibility, right, and be teachable and be able to grow from it, or they will be humiliated and torn down and destroy themselves. Unfortunately, if they go that direction, they're also going to wreak havoc on others, which is why the more they hold on, the longer they hold on to stuff, the longer they're in power, the higher the cost is going to be, not only to them, but to others, right? Till there's a point where intervention is the only thing that you can do to mitigate the threat to themselves and to others. No matter what you do, right? You're going to be the bad guy to them, right? It's like a kid that's rebellious, right? Or a drug addict, right? That's owned by the addiction. Until they are able to come to their senses, right? They have to be mitigated. They cannot continue. There has to be consequences. And those consequences scale in relationship to the seriousness of their addiction and the exponential spread of the impacts of it in terms of ripple effect, right? The more power, position, wealth, influence you have, the heavier the impact, the greater the ripple effect, and the faster it spreads. Which is why it is they undermine their positions. And if we don't do something, the rest of the nations will. And while they're in those positions, the paradox that they're in is they actually undermine their ability to deal with real threats. because their cognitive decline, right? Their mansions of mind turn into ghettos of lies. And so they move people into positions that are incompetent, that are incapable, and that are like them, ruled by fear, or they're just yes men, right? Telling them what they want to hear, to the point where the entire structure is constantly being weakened by every decision they make, to the point where the whole thing falls. That's the paradox. And unfortunately, it doesn't just include them, it includes everybody that's around them. So everybody winds up, to one degree or another, having to pay some level of consequences at a nation-state level, a neighborhood level, I mean, even at a family level, right? That's the problem. You know, and it's like malicious code. All it takes is one compromised box, right? One compromised device, right? Node on the network to actually infect the entirety of the network. Now think about when we talk about, you know, networks, social networks. Think about how they're trying to silence others, right? They're trying to use that stuff to silence others, right? Well, they're telegraphing everything that they're doing, and they will do if they get full control of society. They're also, think about that in terms of media, the broadcast media, right? That's broadcast networks. They're networks. They broadcast. You know, they're signals. Goes back to my talks on, you know, SIGINT and signals intelligence, right? And linking these concepts together, and then showing how things work from a conceptual framework of the epidemiology, right? The sociological, right? And you know, communications, right? So it becomes a communicable disease that they project onto others, and others accept it for whatever reason, to the point where the consequences are so great, and they realize that they've been deceived, and then they go through a phase of being enraged, and you see how the whole thing creates this. I mean, it's almost algorithmic, right? It's a structural integrity. Like if you take a language set from architecture and engineering, right? There's a point at which the structural integrity, due to the stressors on those, whatever you build, a skyscraper, like a bridge, you know, a house, you know, anything, right? You know, in aerospace engineering, we would call the point at which that structural integrity reaches its maximum capacity and exceeds it, something called max Q. And once something hits max Q, right, like a rocket or a jet, or right, it starts coming apart. It's exceeded its ability, its engineering, its capability structurally to maintain integrity. Now think about the word integrity, right? We use that in terms of ethics. Right? So, that's right. So we use the word integrity in terms of bioethics, right? Political, business ethics, right? So moral foundations and ethical foundations, right? So think about the tolerances in a system where those have been exceeded, and the integrity, right? The ability for something to maintain its structural soundness, right, is exceeded by its lack of integrity. When that happens with an individual, we say they've lost all credibility, right? They've corrupted themselves. In many cases, you know, we put them in prison, but we remove them from their positions, right? When that happens in the general population, they go into a prison or they're executed, right? Depending on the scale of the impact of their decisions and their actions, right? So you see how all of these words mean something very important, and how they intersect, to use some of their language on the far left, how these things intersect. And so they have multiple layers of meaning. And that's why moving back and forth in those data sets and in the language sets to explain them, you can see that there's a definitive unity in conceptual frameworks to understand these things, from the micros to the macros. But the people that are actually in power, right, are even trying to redefine all of those, right? So they're actually increasing the confusion, and confusion, right, is taking something that's in a correct context and putting it in a faulty context that doesn't make sense, that can't maintain, continuity or integrity of meaning and purpose, which is what a lie does to truth. Something that's true, they take and they misappropriate, they misapply, they misuse, they mislead. And that's what a lie is. That's what deception does. And so it's not the other way around. The truth doesn't need a lie. The lie needs the truth, right? So that's a process, right? That process is a process of corruption, right? It's a process of entropy, right? It weakens over time. It breaks down. It develops vulnerabilities and weaknesses to the point where structural integrity, be it of an individual or be it of a nation state and the systems and institutions thereof, become so weakened that when they hit that point of zero tolerance, using an addiction cycle terminology, right? When it hits zero tolerance, the whole thing is terminal, and it means that it falls. Because the structural integrity of the whole cannot maintain itself due to all the structural weaknesses, the fractures in it, the corruption of it, the malicious code injected into it, the confusion, the lies, the corruption, go down the list, that have made the entire structure unable to maintain any viability. And when we apply that to national security and to nation states, we say that is a failed state, right, or a failing state. Right? And when you look at that history with the major powers, the rise and fall of empires, you see this same paradigm play out, right? In the same way you see it with individuals. How many times you've seen individuals? Look at what illness does to individuals. Growing old, right? We grow old. Our bodies weaken. Our DNA strands weaken, right? After all, they're self-replicating. Again, all of these things can be applied across all of these disciplines, but everything ultimately is telling you the same thing. Everything is testifying, if you will, as to the reality of things. And when you have a nation state that has reached that's sick, right? That's got the disease of corruption, of lies, a loss of inherent understanding of objective truth. Without truth, you can't have love, justice, mercy, and you don't have humility in it either. So you have pride and selfishness, and all of those things further amplify as they spread throughout the totality of the whole. They further amplify the entropic effects on the whole thing. And it creates, again, a feedback loop, right? A standing wave, if you will, that eventually will bring the whole thing coming down. And a tidal wave of consequences. Well, you do that after, again, if you're, let's put it into a military context. If you have a failed mission, after every mission, you look at what went right, what went wrong, what could be done better, right? It's a debrief, right? You're debriefed, right? You analyze it, right? It would be nice if everything was neat and nice in a linear form, but it's not, right? So you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And depending upon what it takes, where you have an intervention, right? In many cases, until you do an intervention, you can't actually get a full, accurate view of diagnosis of the patient, right? Until you could actually figure out what's going on with them. And that means you have to get them in some place, like a drug rehab center, right? Because they may have all these other contributing factors going on, right? I mean, if you're an IV drug user, right, you've got, a high propensity towards all these other diseases, as well as impacts to other, systems of your body and psychologically and otherwise. So again, you have to first stabilize what's stabilizable, right? And then you can do a deeper dive and then develop some sort of prognosis before terminal. Once something is terminal, right? Like what we call terminal velocity, right? Once it's gone terminal, I mean, the word terminal means the end, right? It terminates. And so it's where we get the word exterminate, right? So, when you have a nation state that reaches failed state from failing state, right? It reaches that terminus. Who knows what's going to happen? It depends on what's left, or if anything's left, right? You got a lot of extreme unknowns. If we're working just in the temporal construct, looking at how things play out within in the temporal finite, particularly in this case, dealing with national security and nation states and failed states, right? It's always more complicated than you want to think, and in areas that you want to oversimplify, and it's always more simple than areas that you think are much more complicated. So you have to sort out all that stuff, right? That's part of the problem. The confusion has to be, dealt with. So you have to see things as they are. And a lot of times, that shakes out over time. Sometimes it's quicker than others, but again, do I think the country's going to fall? No. But it doesn't mean that it can't. There are other things that could affect that. National security isn't just affected by what people do. You have other circumstances, right? And that's right. You could be natural. You could have natural disaster. If you had the Cascade Range and the Yellowstone go up and, a 9.8, earthquake and, tidal waves and all kinds of crazy. You can take it as far as you want to sandbox it, right? But, which is what Hollywood does to create blockbusters. But, there is some value in looking at worst case scenarios, but you also, if you can't just look at the worst case scenarios, you have to look at the spectrum, right? And how you develop that is you develop the spectrum from worst case scenarios, red teaming things out, right? And then playing the blue team to try to figure out how you're going to react to it, right? But develop that spectrum to what you do know where you're at in the present time. And then work from there forward to blue team it, right? And to game out what possibilities you might have and options you might have for contingencies. You're never ever going to know all possible contingencies, unlike this administration's, proclamations that they had looked at, figured out all possible contingencies for Afghanistan. That's a preposterous and completely absurd and arrogant thing to say, right? That means they're omniscient. That's what they're saying. No one is omniscient, except maybe God's omniscient, but that's what they're essentially telling you, that they're God. That's part of the delusion. then they wouldn't put it in those terms, and most people, like in a clinical diagnosis, wouldn't put it that way. And, although they might be thinking it, there are people who think they are, literally. They're under a delusion. They think they are literally, God incarnate, and they're infallible, right? And they know all possible things. I would dare say that this administration is acting that way. Have they admitted one thing they've done wrong? That's right. And so when you think of it that they haven't, right? What does that tell you when somebody cannot admit they're wrong when it's as obvious as their own house burning down and they're denying they set fire to it? It's pride. And pride is the greatest of all the evils, in that it blinds you to the point where you think you actually can pull it off when actually everybody sees exactly what you're doing. And, well, what happens in those situations is that when you're in a denial cycle and your pride is exponentially going up and exponentially fueling your fear of consequences and exponentially increasing the complexity, they can, people in that, individuals, people and nations, go into scapegoat mode. So you can tell because they already have their favorite targets to accuse, slander, blame, right? We in psychology, you call that blame shifting, right? Displacement and transference through means of projection, right? They project what they are doing, have done, and plan to do onto others. Another term for that's telegraphing, right? They're telegraphing it. They're communicating what they're going to do, right? The problem is that most people don't understand that that's what they're really doing, until they've gotten control of stuff and they're forcing complicity. A great example of that's Nazi Germany. A great example of that is Stalin's Russia, right? The Soviet Union, when Stalinism. The same thing with Mao. You see this play out all over the place, and it's unique. It plays out uniquely in hyper-secular, atheistic kinds of constructs, right? It's particularly insidious, right? But it's not limited to that. You see various flavors of that. Islam's a great example of that, right? Radical Islam creates conditions, right? And it does. It's the handmaiden. If you look at the two together, it's like death and Hades, right? And again, they're mirror images of one another, and then they play off of one another to divide and conquer and blame and destroy, right? So that's what you're dealing with. That gets into kind of how the binary simulacrum functions. When you've got a secular control, what nation states do is they have to blame others. And nation states tend to do this anyway. They tend to, do what Mao suggested to Kissinger and the Nixon administration. You blame us and we'll blame you, right, to our peoples. And then we'll just do what we need to do, like to move things forward the way we want, right? That's a great example of the binary simulacrum. Now, how well did that work out? Not well. And it's kind of how our system functions with hyperpoliticization, with the co-opting of our two-party system, right? And the manipulating of it from within for personal gain and power and control, and external doping of both sides by external enemies, right? Hostile powers. So the pride blinds people, and the fear drives people, and the confusion confounds people, and all of it fuels the need to blame others because they are in denial and refuse to take responsibility for the predicament that they've created and the hole that they're going down into. And because the lie demands even, it be fed. It's parasitical. You know, it has to be fed. It's a bottomless pit, if you will. A lie demands it be continuously fed. That's why addiction is a great example of what a lie ultimately does from an operational standpoint. And as that plays out, it's like a bottomless pit, like a whirlwind, right? Like a black hole is a great example, right? And so it becomes a devourer, right? It ultimately starts eating its own people. You know, when it's in just an individual, it starts eating the person, right? It's a parasite, right? It turns the person against themselves and uses the person as a proxy against others. And as that spreads into society within a nation state, it divides the nation state. You have everybody doing what's right in their own eyes. It moves from a confusion and fear to chaos and conflict, right? Ultimately to dissipation, desolation, and destruction. Does that make sense? No, it's not pleasant when you think about it. And sadly, you know, I mean, when you think about how things are playing out here, it does kind of make sense because the nation has been poisoned. It's in a sense acting in part like a drug addict. I mean, which makes sense when you consider that 93% of all pain pills produced in the world is consumed here. And you look at how our enemies, particularly China, is pumping in opiates, synthetic opiates in particular, fentanyl and carfentanil, into this country, and how everything's been co-opted from the medical side and biopharma, big pharma, right? Pharmakia has a definitive impact on the individual and those around the individual. The word pharmakia, right, is the word that it's often rendered as sorcery or witchcraft, but it really means rebellion or enslavement. What its actual definition, the specific word means pharmakia, it means to drug or poison, right? And, you know, that's think about it from a nation state. Think about kings and queens and rulers and stuff, right? You know, people killing one another, you know, murdering one another. There's a reason why you had, you know, the cupbearer, right? The cupbearer would taste the wine, would taste the food for the king, right? They would make sure it wasn't poisoned. As long as they didn't drop dead, the king could eat it, right? And then you think of like stories, like the story of Mithridates VI and his father being poisoned, most likely by his mother. These were consistent things that occurred within the Middle East. There's a pattern, right? And interestingly enough, there was a pattern that occurred within women, daughters, mothers, wives, concubines. You have poisoning, right? Their boyfriends, husbands, brothers, you name it, right? It wasn't exclusively that, but there was a definitive pattern there like that. A great example would be to do a study on Laodicea, right? Laodicea is a name that was prominent during the time period of the Seleucid Empire and Anatolia. Sorry, it's late. What's present day Turkey, right? In Asia Minor, right? During the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in that time period, after Alexander the Great's empire collapsed and broke into four parts, right? You saw that, but this is a consistent thing, right? So again, you have these patterns throughout history that show you these things, and these conceptual cascades are clearly seen in them throughout all the ages and throughout all of the empires. That's why looking at what you're dealing with here as a nation, again, we are a nation that has been polluted, poisoned, drugged, and the impacts of that from a physiological, psychological, moral and ethical and spiritual perspective, as well as an economic and political and ideological point of view. It's all encompassing. It literally infects the entirety of the body politic and the ability of all the seven spheres to function. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's unrestricted warfare. I mean, there's many names for it. It's a kill chain, It's chaining various combinations of the 36 stratagems and other approaches to warfare, right? In context that is meant to do exactly what you see happening. And it's a pattern that you can, when you study warfare throughout the ages, you will see these patterns, and you study the cultures and the rise and fall of empires. I mean, you see a pattern with all the empires. What's interesting is that knowing that, right, now you've got people leveraging that, right? Each empire that tries to that rises to try to take the old learns from the other. It's usually used, most empires throughout all of history, particularly in ancient times. In fact, this holds up in even the modern times. The prevailing empire that replaces the old empire was the one that actually was used to discipline the one that rose and then corrupted itself to ultimately weaken itself to fall. Things have changed a little bit, and America was unique in this, in that we've been able to overcome a lot of these historical patterns, and I think we still can. But what we're dealing with right now is mammoth. And I don't think people realize the scale of the impacts and the entropy at the resolution that's necessary for people to really address the issues and accurately diagnose the problems as best we can right now in a comprehensive view that sees all the interconnections. There's very few people can think at that level from a polymathic perspective across all those buckets and see the interplay. And you surely don't have leaders that can do that. And that's a problem. Well, you can do it piecemeal, but the problem with doing it piecemeal is that, again, everything's interconnected. So you can create cascades if you don't do things in proper sequences, right? You have to understand the big picture, and this is why it takes humility. And, if you look at our society from a knowledge-based point of view is, it's kind of like the division of labor, right? In terms of how we have specialties, like our knowledge is not designed in terms of how we teach to teach a unified perspective, an integrated perspective. It's designed to teach you very specific narrow bands to make you capable of being able to get a job in those areas. It works great, you don't want somebody who doesn't know how, the intricacies, right? The complexities of the human body, being your doctor and doing open heart surgery, right? You want somebody who knows those things. If you don't have somebody that knows those things, that's a problem. So, you have the time period, the complexity of the environment at which the nation state and the peoples, tribes, and tongues and nations collectively, sit in within that environment. And so there's stressors on adapting that, right? And the more that a society has been successful, particularly an empire, right? Or a superpower in this case, I mean, it's very difficult to change thinking in a way that is necessary to avoid what those silos of knowledge and thought can do, especially when you have exponential knowledge. Now, that's another pattern in history, right? If you look at the nation states, there are exponential jumps in technology in all of the empires, in cyclical patterns. And what often happens, particularly in the empires, is that they reach a point where it actually starts fueling their pride and contributes to their downfall. A great modern example of that is Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was extremely advanced. They were incredibly gifted with knowledge and understanding across a lot of areas, and they were driven to do it. I mean, they've always been a very industrialist people, and but when they relied upon their technology, right, with a lot of other factors, right, they became a technocracy. I mean, this is often not talked about, right? The Nazis were as much a technocracy dictatorship as anything. And the danger in scientism becoming the all-knowing God for the society is that it's taken science and inverted its place in terms of its intended context. So they misappropriate, they misapply, they misuse, and they mislead, and they create more problems as their pride quotient goes up, and their fear and confusion suddenly dawns on them when things don't go the way that they thought. That's the trajectory that the whole world's on right now. Chiefly among them, Beijing, even more than us, even though there's a great component of Americans that are just as much, infected by that malady, particularly, on the left. Not to make it political. I mean, it's just that they tend to be more in that side of things. But it's not exclusively that by any means. Well, when it comes to China, and then looking at China and the United States, and then look at other nations, I mean, the United States still has a unique thing in that it does have a foundation, even though they're trying to destroy it and point. That's why our enemies are waging unrestricted warfare against us, right? It's a full onslaught because they know they can't defeat the foundations of it, because the foundations transcend what America is as a nation state. It's actually a spiritual construct of Judeo-Christian thought, which is what they really hate, right? The notion of freedom and grace and freedom of speech and thought, right? That's a threat to them. Human rights is a threat. Even the secularists, the secularist atheists in the West still have a foundational grounds of Judeo-Christian thought, even though they would deny it. I mean, the very language sets they use, they have to borrow from Judeo-Christian thought, even though they deny it. If they're that clever, they should come up with their own language set. The problem, and people have tried. You know that, right? They tried to create that. That was the turn of the century, an intellectual kind of movement of atheists and academics, or academics that were atheists and intellectuals around the world tried to create a language set that was an amalgamation of all others, right? In fact, George Soros' parents was a part of that movement. In fact, that's how he got his last name, if I remember correctly. Oh, yeah, actually it is, because that's his last name. Was an amalgamation. I can't remember the name of the movement. I wish I could remember it right now. I'll have to look it up and do another talk on it. Esperanto, or something along that lines. Yes, it is. And so it's interesting. Well, Esperanto never went away. It became kind of a novelty among certain intellectual sets around the world, all very secularist, right? In terms of how, again, nothing really dies; it just shape shifts and may go underground for a little bit, and then it reemerges until ultimately, all things are kind of exposed, which is kind of the process we're entering into in this part of human history. But that's a great example for people wanting to erase anything that came before and create something completely novel, completely new, when actually there's nothing new under the sun, because to be able to do that, they have to build on foundations of things as building blocks that they want to actually deny. So they become deconstructionists, and then they assemble things in a super, subjective postmodernity, postmodern thought, absurdist philosophy. The absurdists. I mean, nothing matters. There are all these philosophical outgrowths in this kind of, if you imagine it like a field filled with figs and thistles and thorns and briar patches. Right? And they always wind up collapsing, but not before their great tumult. There's great tumult, especially when these people, a lot of the folks were early on, like early socialists and communists. You see a lot of this amalgam going back to kind of various forms of atheistic, humanistic, deconstructionism, all these philosophies that kind of grew out of that. Chiefly among them, a lot of them have a trunk that's connected to, Marx and Engels, interestingly enough. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, because that would be too long a talk. But ultimately, you see the same thing playing out. There's a level of insanity that takes place in an inversion. And if you do, if you spend a good amount of time actually doing an analysis of the ideas and concepts, what you find is that, there are consequences to ideas. There are consequences when they spread, and they have a greater impact on the totality of the whole. And when they take root, see, that's the irony of China right now. Let me give you an example. China talks about their culture, and, they want to do everything with Chinese characteristics, right? But here's the fallacy of China. If China was endowed to be able to do this on their own, they wouldn't have to beg, borrow, and steal it from everybody else, and then brand it as Chinese. That shows the lack of continuity in their own logic, right? They built their society off of Western concepts that they deny have any validity. That also shows you the structural integrity of their system is actually incredibly weak, just like the buildings they build in their cities. That's right. But they'll allow any kind of innovation as long as it suits their needs, right? They're the ultimate opportunistic kind of cultural construct and ruling system in a way, right? So it's communism, right, with Chinese characteristics. It's capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It's always, they're always borrowing and stealing everybody else's ideas, right? And then trying to repackage them. That's exactly what lies do. It repackages something it takes out of a contextual proper framework. And then, if we use some Christian, language here, Satan comes to kill, steal, and destroy, right? And the more that he can get everybody else, right, to use the metaphor, the more that the devil can get everybody else to kill themselves, right, and pretend like that they have nothing to do with it, the better, because it just works out more for them because it's easy for them to steal, right? And destroy them by just feeding them their own destruction, right? While they grow stronger, right? That's the nature of a psychotic, right? That's also what when we talk about a psychopath, right? That's the nation state example of a psychopath. Psychopaths are not chaotic. They create chaos and use it to gain more power. It's parasitical, right? They create the chaos to feed on it and to make themselves look like that they are the answer, when the truth is they've actually diminished everybody else through obscuration, intrigue, machinations, right? They slander, they destroy, they poison, they create the external appearances of something, right? And then point to it. They manufacture the problem, right? And then point to it. And that's a highly evolved system of deception. It's crafty. It's very crafty. So everybody looks at that and they're like, well, the American system's failing and all the versions of the other nations are failing. The only thing that really works here is what China's doing right now. But it's a lie. It's the same thing that Islam does, but it's a lie, right? So they have to diminish something else. It's like a bully. A bully has to diminish somebody else to feel better about themselves, right? But it's a much more cleverly disguised way because China plays the wise sage, right? That's the soft power thing. That's why Biden today talked about, Biden's chosen to go the route of soft power. That's what all his apologists are saying, right? Well, they're mimicking who? Right? Well, they surely are, because they've adopted the nature of the beast, so to speak, which is also the duplicity that you're seeing play out and the lack of concern and care while they tout how great they are, while they tout how incredibly, competent they are and they've done the greatest things in history. Isn't that an irony? In that the very thing they pointed at Trump, that Trump always did, right? Being very bombastic and, hyperbolic, right? They've actually systematized into their entire party. But the outcomes are failures. But they tell themselves and everybody else the opposite. When you look at it for what it is, they have adopted the same means, methods, and the nature of the Chinese system, which is they're creating chaos and they look pretty calm. When you watch the White House, everybody's pretty calm. They just ignore you. They just turn around and walk off, right? And the reason why they do that is because they know it's going to incense people. It's going to frustrate people, right? And so because everything is, most people in the world, including nation states and the people that run them, judge things by outer appearances, right? So they create chaos while they appear to be and project themselves to be calm, cool, collected, and completely successful in everything that they set out to do. And they're not lying. The truth is they have been successful in doing what they wanted to do, which is create chaos, destruction, confusion, right? And then they point out how everybody else is in conspiracy theories. They're unhinged. They're not sane. They're not using science. They're intellectually inept, But the truth is their accusations are telling everybody what they really are. But they look calm while they do it. Calm, collected, They're playing the game, right? That's the nature of the beast, right? That's a snake-like. Well, that playbook that they use is as ancient as the serpent is in the garden in the story of Adam and Eve. There's a reason why it is the serpent, which is rendered as, in terms of the original language, as Nakash, is the most clever, right? Most clever, most crafty, right? Most deceptive of all the beasts of the field. And the field is the world, and the beasts are the nation states, right? The peoples, tribes, tongues, nations, empires, kingdoms, thrones, dominions, whatever, right? So what you see happening is you actually see psychopathic behavior out of this administration that mimics what Beijing does and what Iran does. It's no wonder that they all want to keep lines of communications open, because they're communicating to one another their own lies. They're building again, it's a communicable disease. And if you go back to the original story, whether you want to take it as literal or metaphorically, right? You can take it as an archetype. Well, the problem began with Eve when she began having a conversation with a snake. And not a literal snake, but a beast. And what is that beast? It's a nation state. It's a construct that's bigger than what most people think. See, it's people don't understand word pictures. They don't understand language sets and how they were used throughout the ancient world or even today. And actually, Eve means woman, right? And woman is also often rendered as nations, or a people, right? And so that kind of topography, or that kind of typology in terms of language use is throughout all the ages and all the cultures. But again, if we talk about this, and this is a great example, I'll just keep using this as a metaphor. The longer that Eve talked, the lie was, right, that the serpent told Eve, if you eat from this tree, you'll be like God. Well, here's the irony, right? This is how clever the beast of beast was, right? Adam and Eve were already like God. So the lie was, right, to put doubt in their minds about what they already had. Now, there's a reason why I'm telling you this. I want you to put that into nation states. And what you see happening around you with people saying that they don't have any freedom, that this is an oppressive system, when they actually are installing the very thing that they say that they're trying to free themselves from. That's how inverted they are. They actually lost their identity. The nation state is losing its identity because it's believing lies. And a nation is made up of what? People. And when people believe lies and they're deceived, it infects the entirety of the whole of the nation state. What I'm showing you is a pattern that is a universal pattern throughout all of human history, going all the way back to the source of that story. Because Eve was deceived. What she was deceived by was the inversion, the reversal of something on her, right? And so the serpent, the beast of beasts, said to her, if you eat of this tree, you'll be like God. She already was. So he tricked her and Adam out of their own identities. The same thing's happening here right now in this country, and to the West in general, and to individuals that make up those nation states. That's why it's called a deception. And what it brings about is a great delusion. And what great delusion brings is great destruction. It's a war. Everybody's in a war. And in a war, there's but three kinds of people: soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. Which one are you, and which one are you going to be? That's the only question. And as it is for people, so too it is for nations. There's a reason why I say that. So what you see playing out right now is exactly that paradigm. I've told you the same thing in different ways, tying together multiple seemingly divergent streams of knowledge and understanding and disciplines and language sets across all of time space for all of history, and pointed it to a singular point right here, right now, in the present time of what you see happening and what you're experiencing in the immediate now. Now, the question for everybody is, what are we going to do about it? That's the big question. Because denial is not an option that is going to lead to any good outcomes. That's why I say we've got to have, eventually there's going to be an intervention. Yep, there's no doubt. Well, let's talk about identity. When we talk about Eve having been cheated out of her identity at the macro, right? Let's talk about what do you think identity politics is? It's a false identity, right? And it does put things in categories that are false categories, right? It's a shallowing of stuff, right? So then you start getting into the metasphere and meta war and spiritual reality, right? And the spiritual war playing out over all people and all things. And that gets into real worldview territory in terms of how that plays out from a conversation throughout the ages and to what we're dealing with right now. And, you know, the concept of identity is something that is huge. I mean, if you look at Judeo-Christian thought, identity is important throughout the entirety of our history. It also is important to other nation states and other belief systems, but not the same way, right? When people say that all the religions are basically saying the same thing, they're idiots. They've never actually looked at those religions. Not in any great detail. And if they have, they're just deceiving themselves and lying to everybody else, right? There wouldn't be multiple religions if they were all saying the same thing. There wouldn't be any discussion about it. Everything would just be the same thing. You see, words matter in how they're used and how people construct them to convey messages and meaning. In this case, ideological, theological constructs, right, are important. And so when you see certain things appear in society, they're not unhinged from a historical reality and a spiritual playing out of reality in the meta-narrative of human history and the specific chapter that we're all in the present time that we're all here. And that becomes, they're actually pointers. And, you know, what I tell a lot of folks that are Christians, you know, I'm like, do you know who you are? I say it to everybody. Do you know who you are? Who do you serve? What do you serve? What drives you? The truth? Do you care about what's true? Or do you not care? If you don't care about truth, you're already a lie. You're in a lie, right? And you may even say that you care about truth, but your actions will betray those words, right? Because there's a divergence between action and words. Because you've got a war playing out. Everybody is a proxy or a real warrior for truth or lies, ultimately. In the end, it's about truth and lies. What's the truth and what's a lie? And when you have the very notions of objective truth being obliterated by academia, that's a form of prepping the battleground for total deconstruction and subjective reconstruction of false constructs through misappropriation, right? Misuse to mislead. We call that in warfare information warfare, propaganda, disinformation. I mean, read 1984, Orwell, right? Read any of the literature from that time period, how things become inverted. And then you read 1984 and Brave New World together. And Brave New World is a whole pharmacological, I mean, what do you think Soma is? All right? It's a pharmacological, utopia. It's lawless. It's anomy. It's the concept of anomy. And anomy is normlessness. But it's basically everybody can do whatever they want. There's no rules, no restraints, no laws except conformity. Right? You got to conform to being lawless. You got to conform. So, I mean, if there's no objective structure, right, for society, no objective truth to guide things, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, right? Without any restraint, without having to take any responsibility for anything, right? What is that called? Anarchy, chaos, right? Lawlessness. It's just forms of lawlessness. You can't have a society that could actually do anything. It literally collapses it destroys itself. I mean, it's the opposite of everything you see in actual society. I mean, in the natural order. There's a checks and balance system in the natural order. And so when you start framing things and looking at it from that perspective and testing it out, a definitive logic emerges that exposes the definitive lack of logic of most of what people think they know and see playing out, and even in their own choices. It starts revealing something at the macros down to the micros and back up that most people quite honestly don't want to see, because it requires something of them. And again, that goes back to people not wanting to take responsibility for their own choices, their own actions in their own lives, yet they want complete autonomy, right, to do whatever they want without any consequences. Nothing here in the entirety of this world functions that way. You can't point to one thing that functions that way. Not even the natural order. There are restraints on things. You're not going to see a fish walk down the street. There are certain things that are what they are. You know what I mean? So you can try to redefine things into absurdity all you want, but the truth of the matter is everything is not going to play along with you, and ultimately your absurdity will destroy you, and it will destroy the society that you infect by being, unwilling to see the error of your ways. And even within the construct of humanity, there's checks and balances here, because when a nation state goes that far off the rails, it usually gets destroyed by other ones. Because it destroys itself to the point where it weakens it, and the rest of them come in and pick it off and then devour it. That's throughout all of human history. It's the same thing a disease does with somebody who doesn't take care of their body and sits around and worries about being sick all the time. A hypochondriac, right, has a mental illness that everything is that they feel is it's a form of bondage. It's fear, and fear is false evidence appearing real when it's irrational fear. It creates illness. It actually has real physical and psychological and spiritual implications. And those stressors that it creates, right, creates increased entropy. And increased entropy also creates increased vulnerability. And increased vulnerability also, right, creates increased exploitation of those vulnerabilities by hostile threats. In this case, pathologies of all sorts. Viruses, cancers, right? All kinds of things, right? Because their thinking is actually creating the conditions for it to become real It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the opposite of what we would say the Word of God in Christianity, right? The living Word. Like in the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a difference between, right, the magic of the witch, right, and the deeper magic of Aslan, right, as a picture. And when you start viewing that from a point of view, there's a terminology we use called the power of life and death is in the tongue. Right? What does that mean? Well, you're communicating stuff all the time. Tell me one war that wasn't started by a conversation and a thought in words. You can't. That's right. That's right. Tell me somebody that's been destroyed by lies that didn't start with words and thoughts that played out into actions. I mean, again, there is a constructual framework that governs all things, a higher order logic. There's a design to these things. And people that don't want there to be can say it all they want. They can deny reality. But the truth is, and I've actually said this to some people, if you really think that all this is an illusion, right, and that none of this is real, then, well, why don't you go and climb up to the Empire State Building and nosedive off the top of it? Do a swan dive. If you really believe what you're telling me, because what you're telling me, right, is that none of this is real. Well, if you do that, and I'm standing at the bottom and you stand right up and then can tell me, see, I told you so, I'll believe you. But they'll never do that because there's certain things that they reserve the right to, like, well, these things, they're real, right? When it comes down to how they act, right? I mean, the whole notion of, if a tree falls in the forest, right? Did it really fall if no one's there to observe it or hear it? That's absurd. If you're not there, how do you know anybody else was or not? Right? All that is language acrobatics. It sounds clever, but it's really stupid. Right? It's the same kind of fork-tongued bullshit that happened in the garden and happens every day between diplomats and nation states and in business. And people, for that matter. I mean, again, it's the same thing. Well, there's the balance between the light and the dark. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you prove that with a light bulb in a dark room? If you can prove that with a light bulb in a dark room or anything else that involves a real light and darkness, then I'll believe you. But they can't, because the actual way that everything functions, right, in nature, like when the sun comes up, it illuminates the whole earth. It doesn't just illuminate where it is in the sky, or else everything would be in darkness all the time, right? I mean, you have to test things by what they are. And the unity of things are seen both in the natural order and how everything that is in the physics, the science, right, plays out. All of it tells a grand narrative. And in the end, everybody knows, and they have to make a decision. We call this, in a sense, the valley of decision. It's otherwise known as the valley of the shadow of death. Now ask yourself why. Is there any place on earth you can go where you don't cast a shadow? No, because as long as you're standing here in a three-dimensional world plus time, space, in the temporal mortal coils of your body, right? The only way that there wouldn't be a shadow is if you had light coming out of you. Otherwise, light, right, casts the shadow of you onto the ground. Most people and even nation states eventually follow their shadow into the dust of the ground. Now, here's an irony for you. The curse on the serpent at the very beginning, going back to the Adam and Eve story, right, using that as a metaphor, was cursed to do what? be on the belly, be on its belly in the shadow of, basically in the shadow, in its own shadow, right? It is the shadow. It was cursed all the days of its existence to the dust of the ground. Now, every time you look at a light, what happens is that the light casts to the ground shadows. The light, right? You'll never see a shadow moving towards the light. You'll always see the shadow moving away from it. That's an example in the real world of exactly what I'm trying to tell you, from the micros to the macros. That's why we use the term, I use the term so often, the light of the truth. Because the light of the truth exposes what's hidden in the darkness, which is the lies, which is out of context. It's like a firewall, right? A firewall not only casts light, if we break the word apart, it casts light. It creates light. It also purifies. So the truth, is like the sun. The sun, you can get the closer you get to the sun, if you're not made of the same thing the sun is, by the time you get close enough to it to figure it out, you'll be dead. Because there'll be nothing left of you. You'll be vaporized. But as you're going there, what, does your shadow point at the sun? No, it points away from it. Why do you think you have cycles of the moon? The moon doesn't have any light of its own. The moon only has the light which is given off from it as a reflection from the sun. It actually is where we get the concept of false light. When you put something in false light, right, it's a projection. It's a form of accusation, slander, right? It's a deception. And it goes back to the Babylonian concept, right? The chief of the Babylonian pantheon, which was the moon god named Sin. S-I-N. That's where the word comes from. Because it has no light of its own, except that which it reflects from others. Right? And in this case, the moon being the light from the sun. Actually, there's more light from Earth, if you could actually see at the resolution that it would take to see it. The Earth actually gives it more light, right, than it gives, because it doesn't have any. Right? So that's the irony, right? And that's a concept, right, where you have, that's a great metaphor for what happened in the garden, a metaphor within a metaphor within a metaphor, because here you had the shadow, right, the false light, telling Eve, right, the nation state, if you will, right, the people, represented in a single woman, that if she eats of this fruit, she'll be like God, when she was already like God. What it was saying was it would be like God over her. That's the deception, and that's exactly what happened. And so the identity was lost. The vision was lost. That's what you talk about, like concepts of, dwelling in the shadows. We have all these word pictures we use, these literary devices that we employ that say all of these kinds of things. Yet we deny, right, these very concepts. Just the way it is for people, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. What more can be said about it? You're watching it play out in front of you right now. The people that want to believe lies are obviously believing them, no matter what you tell them. They're slaves to fear, they're slaves to confusion, and they're slaves to their pride, because they cannot stand to actually admit they're wrong in any possible way, which means they're all being led to their destruction. And as it is for people, so too it is for nations. Does it make sense?